Hello, Uganda. Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Hot Seat on 933 KFM. I welcome you, our listeners across this beautiful land, the Pearl of Africa. My name is Patrick Kamara. This beautiful land, the Pearl of Africa, has had a tumultuous past. We've had a set of conflicts almost every time there's a conflict anywhere in Uganda. But there are people who want to have some kind of justice. And so tomorrow, we shall be having the National Symposium on Uganda's Transitional Justice Policy. And my guests this evening are experts on this in this subject. Let me introduce them. I have Mr Francis Nono, Field Office Coordinator, Transitional Justice Officer at the Refugee Law Project. Thank you so much for joining us, Francis. Good evening, sir.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for...
We have Jesse Mugero, Program Officer at ICTJ, Kampala Office. Thank you so much for joining us, Jesse. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Patrick, and our listeners.
I have Margret Ajok. I guess, Margret, you're a lawyer.
Yes.
Your title is quite big, so I'm going to ask you to talk about it so that you can do justice to it.
Thank you and good evening, Patrick. Margret Ajok, and I'm the Transitional Justice Advisor at what many of you would have known commonly as the Justice, Law and Order Sector Secretariat. But because of reprogramming of government programs, it's now the Governance and Security Program. And in particular, I am under the Access to Justice sub-program.
So now, this national healing, building consensus and giving life back to those affected by conflict, and the symposium is happening tomorrow. I'm sure it's going to be broadcast both on television and radio. Why now? Why this? Margaret?
This symposium is basically being organized for us Ugandans to implement the transitional justice policy. This policy was approved by Cabinet in June 2019. There were a number of key policy proposals that cut across what we term as transitional justice. It's a mouthful, and I don't want the viewers to get bogged down by that. But basically, it's seeking justice, peace, accountability, and reconciliation for harms that may have happened during situations of armed conflict.
Before I come to this gentleman, just paint a picture, because a country like Uganda, without tumultuous past, so many horrible things have happened. So when you talk about looking back, really, what exactly do you want to do? And this policy, how will it address the injustices of the past without really bringing, tinkering with old wounds?
Addressing the harms of the past are in various ways, and I wouldn't suggest that it's tinkering with old wounds, but it's basically addressing what people have been living with. And that's basically why we are saying it's a process of healing. It could be personal healing, it could be communal healing, it could be national healing. So we wouldn't say necessarily that it's tinkering with old wounds, because it's something that people have been living with. Sociologists would say resilience. People live with certain things and they get to live with it. They build some kind of resilience, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't want what I would term as acknowledgement. This is a process that I would term as more of acknowledgement by us Ugandans that we've gone through a tumultuous past, acknowledge that we have suffered, and also acknowledge that we can together come up with different mechanisms to deal with it.
So, when we talk about the past and the conflict we've had, are we talking about state-inspired kind of conflict, where the state uses its authority to create conflict? And in the last 40 years, for heaven's sake, the player has just been the NRM government. And 40 years back is quite a long time. So are you not running a risk in a symposium like these to have people who are going to speak their mind and point fingers to the powers that be, and yet the powers that be are supposed to help in making sure this policy works? Your take.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for the question. First of all, Uganda as a country has gone through numerous conflict, as you've said, and every part of this country has suffered conflict as a people. So we have relative peace in this country, and there's a saying that the guns have gone silent, but the people are hurting. So what is the process of healing for people who've gone through conflict and have lost all their loved ones? They can't find justice. They can't find aspect. They've lost everything in life. So the process of healing starts with having a conversation with the victims so that they don't feel forgotten. Victims across the country, there's a saying that, okay, the northern Uganda conflict is the conflict that lasted for long. But there was conflict in Kasese. Do they know what happened in northern Uganda? So this conversation will build momentum that every part of this country has suffered conflict. And we need to build momentum for victims and survivors to get relative justice. So justice means different things to different people. Some people apology themselves is justice to them. The government probably, or any people who've gone through various violence, an apology is justice to them. So I think it's not like reawakening, it's more about building the healing process for victims. Uganda to heal, build momentum for one Uganda where people who've gone through conflict feel like they're not.
Just said there have been very gory images we saw back in the day, gory things happening in Eastern Uganda. I remember as a young man, before I could even be a journalist, the Mukula massacre. I remember the Balonyo massacre in Kasese. What happened was horrible, and I'm sure Kasese will never forget. And you cannot be in a symposium like tomorrow and you don't even talk about the Mukula massacre, or you don't talk about the Balonyo, you don't talk about Kasese. You don't talk about Kichwamba. But when you talk about these things, and of course you want to move on, there's a possibility that fingers are going to be pointed tomorrow. Who is going to accept and who is ready to ask to give an apology? And who will accept that apology? And then and is it just an apology in words? Or maybe some people say, okay, sometimes you can maybe some kind of reparation. I don't know. What are you expected to do? What are your preparation to handle this? Because we may talk this thing, but for me, I see you guys are going to be walking on a minefield.
Thank you, Patrick, and good evening, our dear listeners. You have asked a very pertinent question because indeed that also goes to testify the effect that we have had conflict all over Uganda, not only northern Uganda, but even when you go to West Nile, places like Ombachi, when you come to Teso sub-region, places like Mukura, as you have mentioned, and even in southwestern Uganda, like the Kichwamba massacre, and the current ADF attacks which have been happening of recent. So that shows that there is a need for a discussion. It shows that the healing should be nationalistic and shouldn't be only selective to one region at all. So the discussion for tomorrow is meant to reawaken the need to ensure that the National Transitional Justice Policy is passed to be a law. And as you'll also observe, even in other jurisdictions, Uganda being no exception, there are times that these transitional justice processes are needed because transitional justice is unique in that you have a variety of judicial and non-judicial mechanisms that can be used to help the society address the harms of the past. You could talk of things like truth reconciliation commissions, you could talk of reparations, you could talk of court cases. Uganda, we have the Dominic Ongwen case where we are now waiting for the court to pass a decision regarding the reparations. But we know that reparations alone are not enough until you have these other policy and legal frameworks to ensure that the rest of the country also moves towards healing.
Okay, it looks like now all you're geared to is to have a policy that can turn to law, right? Mm-hmm. So why don't you just leave that to the members of parliament? That's their job. Why must we have a symposium? Somebody raises a motion and you go to parliament. At the end of the day, the buck stops with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you rightly say that it goes to parliament, but we're also cognizant of the fact that transitional justice is a term that is often misconceived by many people. And that means that we need all the stakeholders, including members of parliament, including the community, to actually understand what transitional justice is. So many people would misinterpret it to be something else. Many people would think that we're talking about a political transition, which is not. We are basically talking about a transition from war to peace, from peace to stability, from stability to development. That is what Ugandans aspire for. You look at our Vision 2040, we are looking at a developed Uganda. But if we are to get to a developed Uganda, are there certain things that are pulling us back, or are there certain things that we need to address in order to inspire Ugandans to fully get absorbed into development of the country? And that process of getting people to get inspired and have the momentum to contribute to the national development of the country is if we all have consensus. We all believe that this is our country. This is Uganda. We need to secure it. We need to have peace. We need to have an understanding that we need to develop our country. So that is what it's all about. It's more about conceptualizing. Let everyone be able to understand, if we talk about transitional justice, what is it all about? It's not only about what it could be misperceived to be, but it should be what we are saying that it is, which is basically a transition from war to peace, peace to stability, and stability to development. For us, it's more also about what we sometimes called, and for this could be premature, but there is a term that we use for what we call pre-enactment advocacy. So before laws are enacted into law, you go to the communities, you go to different stakeholders and be able to inform them about what the contents of the law is. So this could be preemptive as well, that we are advocating for the communities to understand and properly conceptualize this, that even when it goes to Parliament, they actually know what the whole.
So you're doing some civic engagement and civic awareness.
Exactly.
Okay, some kind of civic engagement.
Exactly.
Yeah, but in doing so, you run a risk of how far back can you go into Uganda's tumultuous past? Because how far back do you go?
Exactly. So those are some questions which, of course, will be mooted out. And we are actually saying that this is also a consensus building kind of symposium for us to get views on how far we can go back. My colleagues have talked about our tumultuous past. We have pre and post-independence struggles. I mean, pre-independence, we had struggles against the colonialists. Post-independence, we had, civil and whatever strife. And we've also seen a global, I would say, a regional trend towards reparations for colonial crimes. This could actually be an opportunity. I mean, the Bunyoro sub-region has also talked in the past about getting reparations from the British for certain colonial pasts. If you look at the U.S. right now, I think the Black Americans are also in that move.
But for those who have even a bigger case, the Mau have struggled in Kenya. Have struggled in Kenya.
Exactly.
The other day, Prince Charles came, now King Charles, he could not even apologize.
Exactly.
You know where they stand. The Horeros in Namibia.
Exactly.
With the Germans. You know how hard it has been for them.
With the Congo, I mean, you just saw Patrice Lumumba's remains being returned.
King Leopold of Belgium owned Congo like a personal field.
Exactly.
And there were massacres there, almost like a genocide. How far back do you even go? We have been joined by Jimmy Wamimbi, Transitional Justice Coordinator, Uganda Advocates Sans Frontières. But Sans Frontières, you're supposed to be doctors without the borders, right? Something like that.
It is Médecins Sans Frontières who are doctors without borders.
Okay.
Avocats Sans Frontières are lawyers without borders.
Advocates Sans okay, it's the difference, whatever. It's the opposite of doctors. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
You're welcome.
So now we have cases of, for example, National Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Are we talking about something like this to happen, like in Uganda, where you can have people in the room and say, you know what, we're not going to cover our stuff. Let's talk about them. What we did, say we're sorry, and now we're ready to move on. Are we thinking something like that?
Thank you very much, moderator. Once again, Jimmy Wamimbi is my name. I work with Avocats Sans Frontières, an international INGO that
Lawyers Without Borders.
Lawyers Without Borders that are working for human rights and the rule of law, especially for the marginalized communities. And here we're looking at communities like those affected by conflict in this country, but also looking at also those who are affected by exploration of natural resources,
Okay.
So that's where we work as an organization. Back to the question, yes. A truth commission, like the one of South Africa, is one of the many options that this country could take, because it's one of the many measures, many approaches of transitional justice that this country could take. Like colleagues have shared before, we are a country whose background, calls for a lot of questions. We've seen successive conflicts happening here and there, and that means there's a lot that needs to be looked into in terms of how do we repair our past. There's a lot of truth, in courts, and to unearth these different truths, we need such spaces. So, yes, if we had such a commission, it would help a lot unearth a lot of the truth that are lingering in people's minds out there.
Jimmy Wamimbi, Margret Ajok, Jesse Mugero, and Francis Nono. We're going to take a break, and the hot seat will be right back.
933 KFM's Hot Seat. Hear the real story behind the story. Coming right at you. Only on 933 KFM.
Welcome back to 933 KFM, and this is the hot seat. And we're talking about Uganda's transitional justice policy. To begin with, Margret, with you again. So tomorrow you have this national symposium. But really, unpack for us what this transitional justice policy is all about. What are the propositions you're making?
Yeah, so first of all, the key objective of this policy, like you probably already highlighted, is basically addressing the harms of the past using both formal and non-formal justice mechanisms in cognizance, of course, in government's cognizance that there is need for peace, justice, and reconciliation in the country for what might have gone wrong in the different governments of the day. Because this whole transitional justice thing is not about one particular government. As Ugandans, we have a history, and that means that a lot went on in our history. And that means that this policy attempts to address what went on even beyond, or rather before even the current government. We know about what happened in the 70s, we know about what happened in the 80s, we know what happened in the 60s, and even before that. So it's this holistic policy that attempts to go far back.
Okay.
But like you rightly said, one of the stingy issues will be how far back can we go? How ready are we as Ugandans to go so far back? Or how do we even have the resources to be able to facilitate such kind of a process? So the proposals that we make in the policy, one thing I would like to say are context specific. What as Ugandans we have proposed. Because before this policy came into place, we went into extensive consultations all over the country. We're north, south, east, central. We went to every part of this country, tried to look at the trajectories of conflict, what people had suffered, and how best this can be actually sorted out. So we have 5 key policy intervention areas and proposals. One of them is the criminal justice process, and basically the criminal justice process is about prosecutions, and we are not saying much about the criminal justice process because we already have laws in place that would actually criminalize, would cater for that. But what is critical with the criminal justice process, and especially for conflict-related crimes, is participation of victims. Our criminal justice system has not been alive to the participation of victims like international crimes. But here we are seeing a situation, and already the International Crimes Division is implementing it, where victims can have a voice. Victims through their counsel or even through their own representative can actually have a say in what they think that should be the penalties for the person that they perceive to have committed crimes against them. So we are basically, with the formal justice system, we are saying we need measures to enhance victim participation and also some form of victim witness protection.
So from the civil society perspective, Jimmy, if I may ask, how much have you gone in trying to bring in people participate, and what has been your contribution to this policy that you actually want it to be later to become law? How much involvement do we see from civil society and ordinary Ugandans?
Thank you very much, Patrick. This policy, in its implementation design, with government in the lead, the policy is implemented in a multi-sectoral and a multidimensional approach, and civil society being very key our role is very, very critical. One of the roles that we've done as civil society is create awareness, in all the engagements that we've had with communities. As you know, our place is very delicate. We stand between government and the communities out there. So in all our engagements, we've made it a point to popularize the policy and disseminate, the key aspiration of this policy to the community. And secondly, as civil society, we've formed platforms where we network, we meet and see how do we work with government. An activity that we're having, the symposium that we're having tomorrow, is one of those very key moments for us as civil society to dialogue, knowing that it is government's role to create the environment for this implementation, and then we come in to see how to reinforce government's role.
No, you will have a task of building consensus. That's going to be a Herculean task, I suppose, won't it?
Yeah. Thank you, Patrick. The transitional justice policy itself and building consensus on all this, it's a tough task. But one thing that we need to know, it's how a collaborative engagements whereby we bring all partners together. And of course, especially on these engagements, we've had the government on board, we've had civil society bringing down together people, other stakeholders being on board. And I think if we have if you have this momentum going forward and having everyone on board, I think it's possible.
One thing I read is that you want to give life to those affected by conflict. Exactly how? What do you mean, Jesse? How do you understand this? How do you give them back their life?
Thank you, Patrick. One of the key aspects with the symposium tomorrow is to bring back people such as survivors and victims who are often ignored in discussions on transitional justice. I'll speak specifically about the youth, who are the majority in this country, but also who have witnessed secondary trauma or generational trauma from their parents, especially those whose parents were victims of conflict in one way or another. So the discussion tomorrow in the symposium is to help change that mindset of many of us to see that we don't just see the youth as victims or as people who are beneficiaries of our goodwill through transitional justice, but we start seeing such people as people of agency, people who can take a primary role in ensuring that they drive the transitional justice processes tomorrow. So that's the sort of giving back.
Margaret, this is kind of intriguing. You know why? I have seen people getting medals in Uganda. Almost every year, they're getting medals. But you know what? With all respect, Ugandans who have participated in killing fellow Ugandans are now carrying medals and they're called heroes. And tomorrow, some of those medals in a symposium, they will be. A symposium is a symposium. Guys are going to open and will talk, and they say the winners of medals have participated in shooting not an international, not a conventional war nation against the other, but killing Ugandans, and they become heroes. And tomorrow you'll be saying, no, you actually don't deserve. Probably you should be somewhere as a guest of the state in Luzera.
So
it's going to be serious. I can imagine tomorrow. I trust the Ugandans.
Well, it can be serious, but transitional justice is all about. There are many. I would say it's like a process of dialogue. It's like mediation, yes. And that will take me to two components of the policy which are key. And one of them is the traditional justice mechanisms. The traditional justice mechanisms, as Africans, have helped us a lot, even with the ugliest conflicts. I wouldn't go delve into so much of them, but I would talk about what I know best. For example, in the north, Matoput, you acknowledge actually that a painful death has happened. That was not good. The offender comes voluntarily and confesses their crime, and the community from which he comes from owns his crime. They offer an apology, and some form of what we call reparations will take place.
Yeah, but also there's a process of sipping some bitter herbs in northern Uganda. So people will be drinking some bitter herbs in Acholi land.
You know what that bitter herb means? Symbolically, that bitter herb means the pain that the victims felt by the death of their person, and also the pain or the anger that that other person caused, the pain that caused that person to kill. So drinking that bitter herb and swallowing it means both the perpetrator and the victim are swallowing the pain.
Or both of them swallow,
Exactly.
partake in the drinking of the bitter herb.
And that is what transitional justice is all about. It's about forgiveness, it's about compromises, it's about reconciliation.
So now, Jimmy, our sisters and brothers in northern Uganda have already their cultural and traditional way of having some kind of justice, and it's a matter of put, These people even sometimes they have their grand meetings, they kachoka date, and they sit and do their thing. In Rwanda they have their gachacha, but then in other communities in Uganda we don't have cultural justice mechanism, do we?
Yeah.
In Buganda, for example.
Yeah, we do have, only that probably they may not be as developed and as pronounced as probably the one of Acholi is. But yes, all these communities in Lango, in Teso, they have their mechanisms, their traditional mechanism in place. But also...
okay, go on.
The other very important aspiration of the policy, following on the question that you asked, Margret, is there is a component of nation building and reconciliation. We acknowledge that this country has had its fair share of conflicts. A study that Refugee Law Project conducted that produced a compendium of conflicts would show that there's no single part of this country that was spared. So this kind of spaces that we are creating are spaces to begin dialoguing and accepting that indeed we need to begin thinking of national dialogue and reconciliation. We can't go on pointing fingers, accusations and counter-accusations. It won't take us anywhere.
So Francis, how does this help in nation building?
Sure. Thank you, Patrick. And I just want listeners to just get this. When conflict is happening, transitional justice is ways of dealing with the past holistically. Okay? There's no proper line that we're dealing with justice. We're dealing with informal justice. We're dealing with... So all ways that we feel, communities can get back to normal. Now, as Jimmy and Margret have said, every part of this country has suffered conflict. Through our research in Kasese people think it's them that have suffered conflict. The northern people think we suffered. So there is this magnitude that, okay, we've suffered more. This other part, we've suffered more. So we're like, look, every part of this country has suffered conflict. The policy has to come in place and look at the whole country.
Gentlemen and lady, hold on to your points because we're going to take a break and the hot seat will be right back.
KFM
933 KFM.
The hottest debate on all relevant topics live on KFM's Hot Seat tonight. KFM's Hot Seat covers all the relevant topics every weekday 7 to 8 p.m.
Welcome back to 933 KFM, and this is the Hot Seat. My name is Patrick Kamara. My guest tonight, I have Francis Nono, Jesse Mugero, Margret Ajok, and Jimmy Wamimbi. We are talking Uganda's transitional justice policy, and tomorrow there will be a national symposium that will be looking into that policy, and they're looking at having the policy turned into law. Let me take you back. There are some people who have suffered historical injustices. Mm-hmm. I'll give you the community that I know most, and these are called the Basongora. Mm-hmm. The Basongora's land was turned into a national park, the Queen Elizabeth National Park. Mm-hmm. This is land bigger than maybe 5 districts put together. Mm-hmm. When you lose your land, you lose your identity, you lose your culture, you lose your language, you lose yourself and your livelihood. Mm-hmm. They have scattered into Congo. Others have become Bahima. Some Bahima that Banyankore. Some Banyankore think that Banyankore actually they're not. And others have come into areas of Bunyangabu. So for people like those, what kind of justice can happen? Then the Robo Benet community on Mount Elgon, in Kapchoro and beyond. What do you do for such a people?
Well, Patrick, that's tough. That's huge. But I know that for historical injustices, for example, which equate also to colonialism, and that, for example, I would equate to the colonialism. You know that, first of all, the colonialists partitioned Africa the way they wanted to, and that went to our countries, and we were partitioned, and many of us were thrown into national parks, etc. So usually for communities that have lost land, there is a mechanism that they call restitution. And basically it says giving back to them what they lost. But like for the Basongora, like you have highlighted, unfortunately we did not study them, but I know I was in Rwenzori, and I think I studied the Batwa, who have also lost their culture and are trying to do that. For such situations is where I always say there is the issue of compromise. You need to strike a compromise. We need national parks, we need the environment, we need so many things. But that is a conversation that I think these communities can most definitely have with the authorities, and then there's some middle ground, because it's obvious that they will not get back those national parks. But there are some measures that can equate. It can be almost to an equation of what they think that can actually support them. And it also takes me back to our culture, for example. Our culture was eroded by the colonialists. How much would you want to say that the British, for example, give back to us for eroding our culture by bringing what they perceived as Christianity, which we now believe in? It's almost impossible, because if you're telling some people that we need to go back to the tradition, they will not believe you, because they now know what Christianity is all about. So that tells you how complex transitional justice can be, especially for certain situations that have evolved over time, for historical injustices. But it tells you that there can be a compromise. Like my colleagues said, there are certain people that only want the word acknowledgement, that we acknowledge that you suffered so much. We acknowledge and we ask for forgiveness if it's possible. And even taking you back to the whole aspect of forgiveness, for example, right now we are in the 2000s, but there are things that happened in the 70s. The aggressors are not there. Idi Amin has died, for example, but there are his victims. We all, I think, in one way or the other, including my own family also, but there could be something what we call symbolic, which takes us to what we call the symbolic reparations, for example. Symbolic reparations are not tangible. You can't touch them, but they are symbolic in the way that they appeal so much to the hearts of the victims. You talked about the Heroes' Day, for example. But as a country, we've never had what would refer to as a Victims' Day, for example. In those areas that you mentioned, I know, for example, there are areas where victims hold prayers every year. It would probably be something meaningful for victims of different conflicts in Uganda to have a day of memory, a day of commemoration. There is no money that will be tagged to it, but it's something that would be meaningful for my mother, for example, who lost her brother in the 70s, whom she has never seen again, for her to feel that, okay, there's a day that actually acknowledges that I lost my brother and I never saw him again.
In the last 40 years, more or less 40 years almost, a lot of things have happened. I've just been reading a book entitled Another Fine Mess, written by, I think, French-Canadian man called, a woman, I think, called Jude Rivers. Another Fine Mess. Uganda's and the United States fight against terrorism, the wars in this country. It has been bloodletting upon bloodletting, pillaging, killing, destroying, and these accounts, really, if you are going to put Ugandans in a room tomorrow, and they're going to be open and speak up their mind, you're going to hear horrible accounts from these Ugandans. And I know Margret saying, don't go there, but they will go there. They'll go there tomorrow. But then after you've said all these things, so what? So what, Jimmy?
Great. Thanks so much, Patrick.
I used to go to Rwanda every April. I would be invited by the Rwandan government. And people say in the month of April, they somehow go crazy. Why? Because they remember what happened to them. And sometimes people can just go crazy and cry on the streets or do anything. In that symposium, when things are told in a vivid, and people are giving their vivid account, some people can even go crazy.
You're right. We appreciate, and of course, working with survivors and victims of conflicts, from all over the country. There's one thing that we've learned, and normally when you give victims space, or when you give people space to speak about the truth, speak about the painful past, it's empowering in itself. It's a healing process in itself, So such spaces, you would expect people to recollect and recall and probably break down. But for us, it's a beginning place to heal and begin reflecting on the way forward. So it's such a space that we look forward to.
In the areas of Luwero, the Luwero Triangle, the Bush War was fought majorly in Luwero. I remember they gathered skulls and put them in some places. Back in the day, during the campaign, they would put those skulls into one place to say, if you're not careful, you can go back in that past. But the Luwero has a story, a gory story for Uganda. And so when you formulate a policy that we want to turn it into law, how are you sure that this law will actually safeguard Ugandans? Because when conflicts happen and people kill, they have not killed because we lack laws. They have killed because they have impunity. How do you safeguard against impunity? Honestly, there have been laws in our books that if people followed what we already had, this would have been a decent country with no tumultuous past. Francis?
Thank you, Patrick. One thing that maybe listeners can take from this conversation and how we're pushing for the policy to come into law. I mean, we've had conflict before in Uganda. There were laws, of course, in that. And I think conflict itself, one of my professors says that conflict itself is not bad. So how do you deal with the past? The way you deal with the past is what matters most, aftermath of conflict. So the policy itself and the TJ comes into play in this aspect, and the TJ policy itself is more of a deterrent of the past. I mean, like young people who have not known about their past get to know about their past through various documentation that will be documenting as part of a central key aspect of the policy. I mean, like if young people get to know about the past and what has transpired, for example, in northern Uganda, some young people are growing up, they don't know how people suffered in northern Uganda. Some young people are growing in Kasese, don't know how. But if this is brought out and conflict itself, starts in the mind, and not knowing is very bad. We have a theory of change which says to move forward, you must look back.
So, Jesse, there is a possibility that is going to be a conflict, even in a symposium, on agreeing on what you think was an injustice to some people, that was an honorable fight for freedom. Somebody who was a freedom fighter, some people will say, no, you were a terrorist, and others will say, you're a freedom fighter. Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist and listed so in the United States and the UK, and until he became president. Sometimes even the laws, apartheid actually was a law, but it was a bad law. And so, for example, people who died in Kasese, maybe 100, gunned down. There will be some delegates coming from Kasese saying, that was an injustice. But there will be a Major General saying, no, I was trying to put sanity back to our country. You have a big job tomorrow, guys.
No, thank you, Patrick. And I think that just that just shows the importance of this discussion, that it is long overdue, that we have a national symposium where you have all actors from various sectors, from government, from civil society, survivors and victims, all coming to the same table and discussing and saying, hey, this is how we can chart a way forward despite our negative experiences that we have had in the past. Indeed, this is not only unique to Uganda. in various countries in transition, this is always usually the scenario. You have the people who hold political power, still in power, and then the survivors wanting a middle ground. So tomorrow, I believe it is very good to agree to disagree, but also starting to talk and sit at the same table is a good beginning. And we are looking at, if this becomes law in the future, it is more of a preventive action, such that in the future, we are able to have, one of the goals of transitional justice is prevention of further situations like we have had in the past, to prevent them from happening in the future. Let me just quickly give one example. My colleague Nono Francis is in charge of a National Memory and Peace Documentation Center in Kitgum, which is one of the few, almost like a museum place in this country, which documents conflict that this country has experienced in all parts, pre-colonial and even post-colonial time. Not many listeners or even young people have had a chance to visit this place and see our history and learn from it. So discussions like the one of tomorrow are likely to kickstart a desire for people to know more about what happened in the past and how do we ensure that we don't go back to the past.
Okay, gentlemen and lady, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I think we shall open the lines so that we can hear a few people, what they have to say about transitional justice policy and the symposium. What are they looking forward? What should be included? And let me just read these numbers so that you can remember them. And when we come back, you can be able to call. The numbers are 0751 933 900. Let me repeat that. 0751 933 900 or 0701 933 934. We'll be right back.
933 933 KFM.
KFM's Hot Seat. Hot Seat. Hear the real story behind the story. Coming right at you. Only on 933 KFM.
Welcome back to 933 KFM, and this is the Hot Seat. My name is Patrick Kamara. My guests tonight are Francis Nono, Jesse Mugero, Margret Ajok, and Jimmy Wamimbi. We're talking about the National Symposium on Uganda's Transitional Justice Policy that will take place tomorrow. So we're looking through this. Ugandans have already called in before I could even... Okay, we have a call online. Hello.
Yes, Patrick. Thanks for the show.
Yes, you're welcome. What's your name?
You're doing to Ekode, live in Seta.
Ekode in Seta, okay.
Now, mine are two things. One, first of all, I want to thank the guests who are in the studio.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very sensitive issue. Now, the first concern about, which I have is one, the kind of mindset we have. Today there's a lot of hate speech. There's no spirit of togetherness. There's no patriotism at all. How are they going to handle this? Because I'm seeing each day the other tribe, somebody comes with a hate speech, the other tribe to be against the other tribe, which is really affecting us. Then two, where did they put their recommendation? Because if you have people who are in authority who don't respect life, we are just from post-elections and still people are still mourning their loved ones. How are they helping these people? Thanks for the show. Okay,
thank you very much, Michael. Let me just take another call online. Hello? Okay, all right. You know, Michael Ekode just talked about something very important. Ugandans there's a lot of anger and a lot of bitterness in this country. You know, the people who feel excluded, they're not partaking with the national cake, and you know, you will see it. If there is a small spark of political violence, it can take you back to 2009, the Buganda riots, or just recently the 2020 riots during the election. You could see that the country just goes almost in flames in just an hour. Why? Because it appears people are emotionally charged, waiting for a spark. Do you understand the kind of anger and frustration that Ugandans are having? And are they ready to let go, Margret?
I totally identify with the issues of hate speech. And I would like to take us a little bit back when a group of Ugandans were saying that we should have a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I remember during our study, we said that we need to really understand if Ugandans are ready for a national truth, so-called truth and reconciliation process. a process that is not only romanticized by civil society organizations, but a process that should be spoken by the heart of the communities. And indeed, when we did these regional consultations, we found that there were conflicts, tribal conflicts, communal conflicts, that the communities need to deal with at that starting point. It should be bottom up. It cannot be premature from top bottom. So when you hear about tribal conflicts, I'll take you to the consultations I had in the Rwenzori sub-region. I did not know, for example, that the ADF rebellion culminated from a history of colonial injustices where the Bakonjo, the Bahuisi and the rest felt that the Batoro were being more favored by the colonialists. And that most likely culminated into the Rwenzururu rebellion, then to Nalu, then to ADF, which has mutated. So you see that why would you start, for example, at the highest level and say, maybe, of course, ADF is a national issue which has to be dealt with and the government is dealing with. But is there a possibility that there are still those small issues, that the tribal issues between these tribes? And that is why we said this whole issue of nation building and what the caller talks about, patriotism, should start from down. That we recognize as Ugandans that, yes, we have our issues which we should deal with. There are issues, for example, in Luero, of course, that we say are very ugly, that we don't want to talk about, but there are also tribal connotations that come with them. So can the such processes start at that level? And that's where we are saying we have these mechanisms, which have traditional justice processes. I will vividly recall that during the LRA conflict, when the LRA went and killed in Balonyo, in Lango, the two communities of the Acholi and Lango traditional leaders had to come together and talk about it, because it was almost degenerating into a tribal kind of sentiment. So that is where the whole hate and all starts from. So it's as communities, as Ugandans, recognizing that we have our differences, we have to deal with them, and only when we deal with them as communities, then do we have the moral obligation to say that the state has a responsibility. Because you cannot start by pointing at the state when even at your communal levels you have issues.
Many people in this country have not bought into this Project Uganda thing. And
that is what we need to build, this whole transitional
this Project
justice
Uganda
process.
thing.
That's why we are exactly.
It's not well inculcated in people's minds.
Exactly. That's why we are saying that we need to build.
And the presence
nation.
of our cultural institutions has actually even done worse for Project Uganda.
Really?
With all respect, people in Buganda here will tell you Buganda first. And probably they love the nation of Buganda more than the nation of Uganda. I know for a fact, if you come to Toro, people will tell you that we love our Toro first before you even think Uganda. And yet it should be the other way around. We should just be nationalistic and more patriotic about our country, then things will come. And then there are people today who, there's, I don't know how to use it, there is a division of them and us. Them and us, those who are eating and us who are wallowing. And so how do you bring that rift of them and us to disappear? Because you'll be driving on the streets of Kampala, you have your Mpenkoni, you have your V8, those are them. We shall be on our border eating our sawdust, those are us. So the element of them and us, Jimmy, how do you deal with it? Because it ends up giving, how do you deal with it?
Very interesting. Going back a little bit into how do we come to be Uganda, the processes building up to the Uganda we know as of now, realize that colonialism, like my colleague Margret alluded to at some point, was itself a conflict, but also a conflict driver, You realize that at independence, what they handed over to Uganda was not just the territorial boundaries, but also the problems that had been created before independence. So the problem that we've had as Uganda and problems that are not new, the conflicts that we've had, are conflicts that arise from they are in power, we are not, they are having more, share that we do not have. So and that's when transitional justice becomes very, very important. we need to sit in judgment of ourselves as a country and appreciate that before this establishment of colonialism and dividing, we had our tribes and our particular nations. I don't like using the word tribe because it's a demeaning term. We had nations that were living happily, but after independence, the colonialists realized that breaking us into small pieces, calling us tribes, would be easier for them to lead us.
So okay, in conclusion, because in the interest of time, very quickly, maybe this ask you to Jesse. There were earlier calls for national dialogue. In fact, they had reached a certain level that was about to happen. I think it was COVID or something came in, and the national dialogue never happened, even though it had never been given green light by the powers that be. What makes you think that those who were reluctant to embrace the national dialogue can actually embrace this transitional justice policy?
Well, the transitional justice, again, I'll say, is not a silver bullet. Putting the word transitional justice doesn't mean that all the problems are going to go away, but it does promise that if you undertake the process, the way you see a wound, no one likes to go to an old wound. But for proper healing, maybe that's why to prevent it from becoming a bad wound or becoming worse, you get proper medication. And transitional justice promises that if you go through the painful discussions and processes, then you can have a better future for your children and for our children's children.
Thank you very much. Our time is out. Francis, you're parting short in 10 seconds.
Thank you. I think the Transitional Justice Symposium tomorrow is a very timely call for all Ugandans to start up this conversation, and I wish a number of Ugandans to join us. It will be broadcast on NTV, and we're hopeful for the law.
Thank you. And Jimmy, you're parting short very briefly.
Thank you so much. Our listeners out there should know that Uganda is ours, and we need to appreciate it and learn to live harmoniously. It's true our history is not a good one, but we can start from here and have a better future.
Margret, you're parting short.
I believe that we can attain justice through different ways, very simple ways, and we should look at this as an opportunity to reckon with our past and also to prevent future conflicts. So that's how we'll be able to build our country and sustain it.
Margret Ajok, Jimmy Wamimbi, Jesse, Mugero, and Francis Nono. Gentlemen and lady, I want to thank you so much for the time you have given us. You've added value to our platform. So we're looking forward to the National Symposium on Uganda's Transitional Justice Policy tomorrow, and we hope such a symposium will help in building consensus and giving life back to those affected by conflict. Good night.